But for more on the federal budget, I'm joined right now by Democratic Representative Jim Himes of Connecticut and Republican Representative Leonard Lance of New Jersey, who have introduced legislation dealing with executive pay at companies who have been bailed out by taxpayer dollars. Congressman, gentlemen, thank you very much for being here this morning. Good to see you.
Happy to be here.
Thank you very much.
All right, Congressman Himes, let me first start with you. The president last night talked about the federal budget. He received one of his toughest questions in regards to that. I want you to take a brief listen and then get your reaction on the other end.
We have to make the tough choices necessary to cut our deficit in half by the end of my first term, even under the most pessimistic estimates. At the end of the day, the best way to bring our deficit down in the long run is not with a budget that continues the very same policies that have led us to a narrow prosperity and massive debt. It's with a budget that leads to broad economic growth by moving from an era of borrow and spend to one where we save and invest.
Representative, what do you think? Reasonable?
Yeah, I think, look, I applaud the president and his budget for being very honest. You know, we're not going to do a lot of supplemental stuff. The American people will see right off what is being spent. I also applaud him for taking on the big issues of this day, energy, health care reform. The one concern I have, which frankly is shared by many members on Capitol Hill, is can we afford this whole thing? I personally would like to see a budget that shows the American people and shows us that at some point in the future this budget will be balanced, and we haven't seen that yet, and I know that there are a lot of people on Capitol Hill who are looking to see that to be the case.
Congressman Lance, you're sort of shaking your head. I assume you're probably one of those people. What will the conversations be like on the Hill today? Because a lot of people suggest, you know what, you put a federal budget together, but you put that together 3 months ago, and a lot has changed in 3 months.
Yeah, I think we have to be concerned about the debt long term. I recognize we're in a very deep recession, and I'm a Keynesian. We need to stimulate the economy. But moving forward, after we're out of this recession, I am concerned about the long-term debt figures as suggested by the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan in nature. And I do not think we should double our debt from $10 or $11 trillion to $20 trillion over the course of the next decade. I really believe that that is very harmful to our children.
Congressman Himes, let's switch gears for just a moment, because you used to work at Goldman Sachs, and there's a lot of outrage about what happened last week, the decision by members of the House to pass this legislation that would suggest a 90% tax on people making $250,000 or more. It was not only outrage, I believe, on Wall Street, but a lot of people in this country said, wait a second, what happened to the free capital markets? Now, you had some concerns about that. What are those concerns, and have we gone too far?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you say there was outrage. There was outrage on both sides. Obviously, the American people were in a state of white-hot anger around the whole AIG situation. And Len and I have banded together with a group of people on the Financial Services Committee to take this discussion to the next step. I think what you saw last week was legislation that was hasty, responding to that anger, and now the legislation that Len and I have introduced with a group of others takes it the next step and says, let's agree that taxpayer dollars be used responsibly and prudently, but let's also remember that we need to stabilize this industry and not do things that are ultimately going to damage it. The thing that got lost last week is that we own AIG, and we need to start thinking a little bit like owners and say to ourselves, if we're going to get the $180 billion back that we put into AIG, we need to make sure that it is stable and that we sell it someday in a healthy condition. And I think the legislation that we're introducing it doesn't solve all these problems, but I think it takes an important step in a constructive direction.
Congressman Lance, let's walk through this, because basically what you're saying is this legislation will tie executive compensation to performance at institutions. Now, many people would say that's exactly the way compensation is already tied. So what will this piece of legislation look like? What can I expect to see?
That clearly was not the case with AIG, because as Congressman Himes has said, we the American people own 80% of AIG, and those bonuses were, in our judgment, not appropriate, and the American people were quite appropriately outraged. Our legislation, and I want to give Congressman Himes principal credit, because he has reached across the aisle in a bipartisan way, is a responsible way to move forward, and I predict that it will come out of committee today, and I am hopeful that it will pass. Congressman Himes and I
what will come out of committee? What does it say? What are the details?
The bill is really The center of the bill is this, that compensation for TARP participants, and specifically CPP participants, will be tied to performance. And that's a really important idea because, A, that should be true. We should all agree that performance should drive compensation. The bill asks the Treasury and a variety of the other regulatory bodies to develop standards for performance and reasonableness that will allow us to come together and say, you know what, if you do superbly well within a TARP firm, you hit your targets and you do what you're supposed to do, you'll get well. However, if you fail, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, you won't. And I think that that's a principle that most Americans are comfortable with.
So Congressman Lance, just to follow up on that, so then you're suggesting that it is going to be the role of the government or the Treasury Department to determine what those targets are, and therefore, based on the targets that the Treasury Department or lawmakers make, that will then determine whether or not people get compensated appropriately.
This is because of the infusion of federal funds, of taxpayer funds. And I think it's important to recognize that the American people are heavily invested in this, and some of these companies would have failed except for the involvement of the American people.
Great point.
And it's important to remember that this is narrowly targeted at TARP participants. We have a much larger discussion that we as policymakers need to have, which is that compensation structures on Wall Street are part of the reason that we find ourselves where we are today. They were effectively one-way bets, where if you shot the moon and did well, you got paid very handsomely, and of course if it went horribly wrong, as it turns out, we all pay. Now we need to be very, very careful as we think about the broader implications here. I think we need to think about how do we empower our shareholders, who at the end of the day have the responsibility to make sure that their companies are run well, to make sure that compensation plans outside of the TARP really reward good, long-term, stable performance rather than last Wednesday's trade.
Okay, let me ask you guys a question, which is something that you touched on briefly, Congressman Himes, just moments ago, and that is when you talked about we own AIG. You know, we own 80% of the company. We should have been able to do something about the bonuses. Well, the Fed chairman and the Treasury Secretary are suggesting that we, in essence, don't own the right to make the decisions for these companies because it doesn't fall under the guise of a traditional banking institution. They are asking for unprecedented levels of power. Is that acceptable? Would you agree to give that to them? Let's start with you first, Congressman Himes.
Well, I think the president makes a very good point, which is it turns out we've got this incredibly large shadow banking system capable of taking the same kind of risks that the banking system has historically taken. Now, the federal government has lots of control and ability to seize and control banks because, of course, banks do carry some degree of public protection, whether it's FDIC guarantees. Now it turns out we've got this whole shadow banking system where it's not clear that the government has the power to intervene when things go horribly wrong. So I think that this is a very good point that the president is raising. If these entities that are outside of the banking system can create systemic risk, we as taxpayers, we as policymakers need to be able to look at what they're doing and in cases where we think they're acting irresponsibly, intervene to avoid this world that we find ourselves in today.
Congressman Lance, are you prepared to give Geithner and Bernanke that power?
I'm prepared to have legislation coming from the Congress, and I think in a bipartisan and in a reasonable way, we will craft legislation in this regard, and we will seek the advice of Secretary Geithner and Chairman Bernanke, but ultimately it is the responsibility of the Congress to pass responsible legislation, not going overboard, but recognizing that there has to be some regulation where there has been none in the past.
Congressman, is it constitutional, though? Congressman Lance, I mean, you know, we haven't seen a federal body like this since the Great Depression when the Federal Reserve Bank was created. You know, our own Andrew Judge Napolitano over here at Fox News says this is not a constitution. The Constitution would have to be amended in order for this to occur. You agree with that, Congressman Lance?
This is why Congress will be holding hearings, and we want to hear from legal experts, and I have great respect for legal views. I am an attorney, but I do believe Congress has the power to engage in regulation. I do not want it to be overboard, but I think that we will be reviewing this in a bipartisan and responsible manner, and I look forward to working with Congressman Himes and other members of the Financial Services Committee on this issue.
I would just add, you know, you've got a Republican and a Democrat sitting here. The point is that the importance of making sure that we stabilize not just the controlled entities, the banks, but those other entities out there who take on enormous risk, like AIG, that could bring down the system. This is not an ideological fight, and there are potential legal issues, but the point is we will come together as two parties to say that if there's going to be an entity out there that can crash the system, we as taxpayers and policymakers will find some way to make sure they don't crash the system.
Well, this is very refreshing to see the two of you guys sitting here together. I applaud you. Keep up the work, and keep us tuned in to where this legislation goes. Thanks so much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you very
All right,
much.
coming up, Treasury Secretary